Well, to get started, especially for the part of the public, of the audience, that is getting into Bitcoin content for the first time, what is Bitcoin? And you mentioned in your book that Bitcoin is one of the hardest money ever discovered or invented. What is that? Why is that?
Yeah, so if I wanted to explain Bitcoin to somebody who's a beginner, I would focus on its function, what it does. I wouldn't focus a lot first on explaining how it works. In the same way that if I wanted to explain to you what is a car, I would explain to you what the car does rather than try and explain how it functions. So for me, I think the simple way to understand Bitcoin is that it's a new form of money. It's a currency, just like your national currency and just like your government money. But it's different because it doesn't have a central bank behind it. It doesn't have a government behind it. And its rules are controlled by its users, and its monetary policy is set in stone. Nobody can change it. And so the reason it is the hardest money ever, so it's a money like all other monies in some ways, but it is different from all other monies in that it is the hardest money that we have ever discovered or invented. In other words, it's the money whose supply can be increased the least as a response to increases in demand. There's no easy way to make more Bitcoin. There's no magic printer that can make more Bitcoin on demand. We know exactly how many Bitcoins are going to be produced each day, each month, each year, and whatever the demand is, that's the number of Bitcoin that's going to be produced. So it doesn't matter if 5 people are using Bitcoin or 5 million people are using Bitcoin or 5 billion people are using Bitcoin. Every day these days we get 900 new Bitcoins being produced. And that's always going to be the case. So this makes Bitcoin unique. There's no other money that is like that. Every other money, their supply is dependent on their on the quantity demanded, but with their supply can be dependent on the demand. As the demand increases, people produce more of it. But with Bitcoin, there's no way of making more.
Bom dia a todos. Welcome, Dr. Saifedean. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. So you actually just answered the question that I would ask you, like, how does Bitcoin solve the inflation problem? So I'll actually jump for the next question. How secure is Bitcoin? And recently, the founder of quantum encryption company, David Williams, stated that Bitcoin could be fundamentally undermined as soon as 2026, unless the software is updated. What's your take on this? Does it apply to other cryptocurrencies? But mainly on Bitcoin that we're talking right here.
I don't think so. I think a lot of people have always found ways of saying, yeah, this Bitcoin's broken, Bitcoin is not going to operate, but it continues to work and it continues to succeed. And I think more interesting than thinking about the technical reasons for why Bitcoin might fail is thinking about the technical reasons for why Bitcoin is likely to succeed, and specifically, I think the economic reasons, the economic incentives behind it. So ultimately, when people say that new innovations in quantum computing are going to kill Bitcoin, I think they're missing the point in that what Bitcoin does is that it monetizes processing power. And so it allows you, if you have an incredibly powerful computer, it allows you to turn that into money by protecting the network and by mining honestly on the network. So this dynamic does not change if the amount of processing power in people's hands increases. The more processing power you have, the more profit you can make from mining Bitcoin on the network. And so if you have more processing power, that means you can make more profit. So nothing changes about the fundamental security model. It's just that Bitcoin finds a way of making the use of high quantities of processing power profitable. Whereas if you try and use it in a way that is destructive for the network, it stops being profitable. And so it's very difficult for people who don't have an economic incentive to be able to build strong processing power and to be able to build large computers and to be able to build the infrastructure that would be more powerful than what the market encourages, you know? So think about what happens when the private sector tries to build something. Constantly being subject to market competition and constantly having to improve, you get a much better product than when you're producing a product from, say, government committees which don't have the same kind of incentive to improve their products.
Well, going back to your first answer that you mentioned that it is an alternative to central banking. Why is that? And even more, in a recent survey conducted by Deloitte with global leaders and executives, they mentioned that they see digital assets as strong fiat replacement or alternative in the next 5, 10 years. How do you see this? Do you agree? And why?
I think so. I think that was, the central argument in my book, that what Bitcoin allows us to do is that it's software that can do what the central bank does. So if you think about the main and most important characteristics and properties of what your central bank does, is the central bank um, controls the monetary policy and decides how much money there exists and how much money is in circulation. And then the second thing is that it handles the processing of payments. So it decides who can send money to who. So both of these things are usually the purview of the central bank, particularly when it comes to international transfers. So Bitcoin allows us to replace those two functions with software. We have computer code that decides what the money supply is. And also we have computer code that makes it so that anybody can send a transaction if they just happen to have the correct private key. So anybody can move any coins if they have the private key for them. So you replace the entire process of censorship and surveillance and payment supervision that central banks have with cryptography. And you replace monetary policy with an algorithm of fixed money supply and a predetermined growth rate. Now it's become clear that now we have free market competition in money, that Bitcoin is out there and it is competing with these other currencies out there today. And it's becoming, I think, clearer every day that it's difficult to see how governments can stop Bitcoin. So it's time to start thinking that we actually have real competition in money. And so we're going to get this competition determined based on the merits of different currencies. And I think, national currencies, they are built to devalue. The point of having them is that the government uses them to finance its spending by devaluing the money of the people of the country. So we are going to witness government monies devalue more and more over time, whereas Bitcoin's supply is not going to increase beyond what is expected. So I think it's highly likely that people will choose Bitcoin, and it's not just if they choose Bitcoin, because even if they don't choose Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin is going to go up, whereas the value of other currencies is going to decline. So over time, the value stored in Bitcoin will likely increase. So in reality, Bitcoin is going to become a more important part of the global money market, and we're seeing this happen inevitably.
And just following up with this question, does it apply to other cryptocurrencies?
I personally don't think so. I don't think that any of the other cryptocurrencies has the one essential ingredient that Bitcoin has, which is the fact that its monetary policy is not under anyone's control. Bitcoin is the only one that can credibly claim that this is just a neutral software protocol that nobody controls. So nobody in the world can change the supply of Bitcoin. But with all the other currencies, it's very trivial to see that a small group of people could, in fact, change the supply of these coins. In fact, the second biggest currency, we've seen them conduct many, many, many hard forks. And with each hard fork, you can change the supply, you can increase the supply, you can change the rules of the network, you can censor transactions, you can roll back the chain as they've already done before. So with each one, you're demonstrating that the value of these networks is essentially in the rule by the group of people that are in charge. And it's generally the people who are programming it and the people who are responsible for the pre-mine and the people who launched it and the people who marketed it. If any digital currency has achieved any kind of name recognition, then it has a small group of people behind it. So in my mind, that makes them different from Bitcoin in that they're not protocols. They're more similar to companies. And I don't see any value in a currency provided by a private company when we have a currency that is provided by a protocol that is neutral. When you're buying one Bitcoin, you're always going to be owning 1/21 million of the entire Bitcoin network. But when you're buying one altcoin, whatever altcoin it is, you never know how many other coins there are on the network. It could change tomorrow. They could double the supply tomorrow. You never know. And it's happened with many coins before, and it can happen with many of them.
Okay. Dr. Saifedean, you were talking about the value of Bitcoin. So I'm gonna ask you the easiest question of this interview. How do you see the price of Bitcoin like by the end of the year or the next month?
Honestly, I don't have any strong opinions about what the price of Bitcoin can do under the framework of a month or a year or 2 years or even 3 years. I would not be surprised if it goes down 50% tomorrow or 50% in the next month, or it goes up 50% tomorrow or 50% in the next month or next year. So I think after studying this for a very long time, I think my price model for Bitcoin is that the price is going to be significantly higher in 4 years from today. 4 years from today, I know that the price is going to be significantly higher than now. This is what I would be willing to say. Up until 4 years from today, I don't know. We could crash, we could go up, but I know that 4 years from now, the price is going to be much higher than today. In fact, I've looked at the numbers for this. In all of Bitcoin's history, it's always been, on every single day of Bitcoin, the price has always been higher than the price 4 years earlier, always more than 5 times higher. So the price is always more than 5 times, except there was one day in which the price was about 4.3 times higher than the price 4 years earlier. And in all of Bitcoin's history, there were only about 100 days in which the price was less than 10 times higher. So with all likelihood, I can tell you that the price is going to be at least 3 times higher than what it is at any particular point in time. 4 years down the line, it's going to be at least 3 times higher. I think there's a very high degree of confidence in this kind of prediction. And I think there's good reason for it, because 4 years from today, the daily production of Bitcoin is going to be less than half. It's going to be around half of the daily production of Bitcoin that we have today. But if Bitcoin is still alive in 4 years, then most likely the quantity of demand is going to be higher than what it is today, because it's lived for 4 years, it's proven itself to survive, and so more people have heard of it, more people trust it, more people expect it to stick around. So demand is going to be almost certainly higher. But marginal supply, the daily new supply being produced each day, is going to be about half of what it is. So I think that can only mean that the price is going to be significantly higher than today.
But one thing that we see, and you mentioned, that can actually move the price is also the demand, right? And the demand is also related to the use cases. And we have seen different use cases in the past few years, from payments to cross-border transactions to even transaction trading and so on. How do you see the evolution of these different use cases, and how do you expect this to evolve? And if there are any other use cases for Bitcoin?
I mean, I think, when people talk about other use cases for Bitcoin, I think they're missing the point that Bitcoin's total addressable market is the biggest market in the world. This is the biggest single market on the planet. Money is the single biggest market out there. So if you think about how much money people hold in terms of cash, physical cash, in terms of checking accounts, in terms of saving accounts, and then you think about the substitutes for money that modern people have to hold because their local national currencies are usually very bad. So people don't hold cash and don't hold checking accounts, they hold government bonds. And then they also hold sometimes real estate. They don't hold it because they want to live in it, they hold it as a store of value. And sometimes they also hold art, and they also hold commodities or stock indexes, or all of these things whose only purpose is to beat inflation. You're not out there to invest, you're just trying to have cash that beats inflation. If you look at that addressable market, it's somewhere between 100 to 200 to 300 trillion dollars, depends on how you calculate it, but it's at least 100 trillion dollars, and it's closer to somewhere between 100 and 300 trillion dollars. There isn't another big market. So next to this, all these other use cases that could potentially be mentioned are rounding errors, and I don't think it's meaningful to even discuss them in the same context. There is nothing that has $200 trillion of demand anywhere in the world. There aren't goods that have $200 trillion of demand. So Bitcoin's addressable market, Bitcoin's use case is enormous. Bitcoin is still at less than 1% of where it could be, just based on its use as a form of money. So I think beyond that, there isn't much. There isn't much that can add value. So whatever it is, what other use case do you have? It's going to be a rounding error next to this. And I think ultimately, all these other use cases, this is, I think, where a lot of the confusion in the crypto space comes from, which is all of these use cases, they just need money. They don't need a specific monetary system. So, if you open a restaurant, your restaurant just needs somebody to pay you with money. You don't need to have a monetary system for your own restaurant where you have your own currency, where people need to conduct foreign exchange transactions before they can buy food from your restaurant. So all of these apps and all of these other applications that are presumed to be important for digital currencies, all of these things just need a native token, and then they will be run on second layers. And I think we just need one money, and we just need it to be a simple protocol, and then everything can be built on top of it.
Very good. Saifedean, can you share with us what like a Bitcoin standard would look like? How does it compare like to for example, for a gold standard patron that we see nowadays?
I think I'd argue that the Bitcoin standard would be a lot like the gold standard. It would bring a lot of the properties of the gold standard in the 19th century to the world of the future. It would be more similar to the gold standard in the 19th century than it would be to government money in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, because government money was the monetary standard that was prevalent, government money is constantly being devalued. It loses value over time, and it serves as a bad store of value. So people don't have the ability to save. So people in the 20th century don't save, and they spend a lot, and they don't think a lot about the future. They can't afford to think too much of the future because they're constantly watching their money lose value over time. And they don't have a reliable way of providing for themselves in the future. If you look at the world under the gold standard, I think people then could save more, and their savings would appreciate every year. Your gold was the thing that we could make the most, that we could make the least of. And so every year we made more apples, more oranges, more houses, more cars, more everything, but we made very little more gold every year. And so the value of gold was increasing compared to other things. So therefore, you had the incentive to hold on to your gold for the future, because if you waited 1 year, you could buy more of it. So if you wanted to buy a house right now, you could buy a house right now, or you could wait another year, and most likely with that, just by waiting, you would be able to afford a better house over the next year because your money would appreciate in value. So people in that world had an incentive to save. And I think this would reflect not just on financial decisions and financial behavior. I think it would reflect on all aspects of personal behavior and personal decisions, because when you are able to save for the future, you're able to provide for the future, which reduces the uncertainty around the future, which makes the present, which gives you the ability to act in the present in the service of the future. And so I think a lot of our world in the 20th century, you look at the problems that the world faces, I think a lot of them have to do with inflation. And, of course, a lot of it is hyperinflation, a lot of it is fast inflation. But I think even the slow inflation that you see in decent currencies, even the slow inflation that you see in the dollar and in the euro, will have very significant impact on people's time preference, on people's ability to think about the future versus the present. And I think this would lead to, and I think Bitcoin, by providing people with the ability to save and to hold the money that holds value into the future, is going to very significantly alter the way that the world behaves. I think it's going to make everybody much more future-oriented rather than present-oriented.
Good. Let's talk about sustainability, and especially given that earlier this year, there has been a lot of media on top of this issue. Elon Musk stated that he wanted a greener Bitcoin. What's your opinion regarding sustainability? Do you think sustainability is an issue around Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies?
I think the way that we really need to think about this issue is that the way that humanity improves its living standards is always by using more energy in order to meet our needs. In other words, it used to be that the average human being had to work with their own hands to provide their needs for themselves. Thanks to modern energy, thanks to the ability to use modern energy sources, we're able to have a lot more work done for ourselves. Each person today, on average, someone in America will have something like 100 or 200 human beings' energy being dedicated toward serving their needs every day through the energy that they consume in their daily uses. So you use electricity in order to heat your house rather than you having to go to the woods and cut down trees and heat the house. Instead of running with your feet, you get into a car that burns fuel and moves you much faster and much safer and much more reliably than your feet. Instead of swimming across the Atlantic, you get into an airplane that flies you in the Atlantic. And the way that it does it is that it consumes a lot more energy. Instead of washing things with your own hands, you buy a washing machine where you just put the laundry and then the electricity does the work for you. So using electricity is a good thing. And I think a lot of people are confused about this today because they tend to think that electricity is a bad thing, that electricity is something that we need to stop. And I think that's ridiculous. Electricity is one of the most important inventions that humanity has ever made. Electricity is the reason that electricity and energy use in general is the reason that we can survive winters almost effortlessly. It's the reason that our quality of life continues to improve. It's the reason we can move around. It's the reason that we have electronics. It's the reason that we have all of the digital technology of the world. So this is just what we do with everything, and for me, it's very strange that people say that, oh, well, Bitcoin consumes so much electricity. So yes, that's exactly why your washing machine is better than washing with your own hands. It's exactly why your airplane is better than you swimming across the Atlantic. Better, more reliable technology consumes more energy. That's how we are able to build better machines. We make engines that consume energy and then do the work that we as human beings could do otherwise. They do it at a much lower cost, which requires us to spend a lot less time, and they do it much more accurately and precisely. And that's what Bitcoin does. Instead of having central banks run monetary policy, we have machines do it. And machines do it much more efficiently, because if you want to think about the cost of running Bitcoin, you have to compare it to the alternative. And the alternative is not that we just have this magical magical cast of priests who figure out the optimum monetary policy from their central bank. The alternative is that we have the monetary policy that we've had over the last century, which we've seen means inflation, and it means constantly losing value of your money, and it means business cycles, and it means recessions, and it means stock market crashes and financial crises, and all of these things are a product of having primitive monetary policy that doesn't run on electricity but runs on manual human direction. So in the same way that we used to have horse-drawn carriages, and that meant that we would walk around with a lot of horse excrement in the street. We got rid of horses, we replaced them with cars, and cars are much cleaner, and now we don't have to worry about cleaning horse excrement from the street. Similarly, Bitcoin does the same thing. Instead of having central banks waste a lot of resources, destroy a lot of economic value. And of course, another important way in which they burn and waste resources is through war. Central banks finance war, and that causes a lot of destruction. Instead of having all of that, we can have a neutral protocol that does this simply by consuming electricity. So I think it's a great use of electricity, and I think it's very telling that you have people like Elon Musk say this, because Elon Musk's entire business model with Tesla depends on pretending like his cars are environmentally clean and green and friendly. And that's how he gets his subsidies. But in reality, building these electric cars requires an enormous amount of energy, and you cannot build these cars without building enormous fossil fuel plants. So all human progress depends on this, and people need to start asking themselves the same question about their washing machines first if they want to start asking that about Bitcoin.
Okay.
Good point.
Doctor, moving this conversation to the technology side, what about the Lightning Network? A second layer protocol built on the top of the Bitcoin blockchain to ensure instant transaction. Can it solve the scaling problem? And if also you could like explain better for the public what is about this Lightning Network exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my book, The Bitcoin Standard, I argue that the way Bitcoin scales is that it scales as a second layer, or on second layer. So we'll have ways of conducting transactions with Bitcoin that are not similar, that are not on-chain transactions. You know, Bitcoin can do maybe 500,000 transactions on-chain every day, which is a pretty small number, you know, compared to the total number of transactions that happen all over the world. But Bitcoin's transactions are cash transactions, they're final settlement transactions, so they can't be compared to consumer payment transactions. They're more similar to settlement transactions between financial institutions. And so Bitcoin's on-chain transactions will be like settlement transactions, but then there will be second layer solutions that will carry out individual transactions similar to, you know, with your government money, how Visa and MasterCard will carry out a lot of transactions. I think on Bitcoin, we're going to see these second layer solutions develop. And I think the most important one is the Lightning Network. And we see the Lightning Network continuing to grow fast and continue to get more users. And, you know, as Bitcoin adoption grows, it's only natural that Lightning adoption will grow because Lightning has a you know, it's a much cheaper and faster way of carrying out transactions. So, you know, it requires a little bit of initial investment in terms of time and effort, and it requires you to put up some liquidity in order to get into the network. But as Bitcoin transaction fees rise, I think we're going to see more and more adoption of Lightning.
And on top of this answer here, do you think this Lightning network could also help solve the scaling situation in terms of mass payments, mass transactions, and so on?
Absolutely, yeah, that's what I was referring to. It's, I think there's essentially no limit on how many transactions can be done on Lightning because it uses the multi-sig functionality, so you can just continue to do more and more transactions. And as more nodes enter the network, then the liquidity increases and the scale for carrying out transactions can increase. I think most likely in my next book, in the Fiat Standard, it's called the Fiat Standard, I discuss how I see the Lightning Network developing. And I think it's going to be a very much more decentralized version of current banking. In other words, we're going to have most likely Lightning nodes will be like financial institutions, but we're going to have a much larger number of these Lightning nodes, and most individuals will be connected to a couple of nodes, but these major nodes are going to be connected to a very large number of users, and so the vast majority of users will only be a few hops away from one another. And I think once you know, once the more the liquidity grows, the more the scale of transactions that will be carried out, the more people will be able to settle their payments on Lightning.
Thank you.
Perfect. Let's talk about regulation. We have seen different countries having like different approaches when we talk about regulation on cryptocurrencies. Do you see, I don't know, maybe some international regulation coming forward, trying to regulate across the country, all the countries, or how do you see the regulation and institutions going related to Bitcoin?
It's you know, it's not easy to tell because most governments don't know what they're doing, and it's not you know, it's not something that's been around for a while, so they don't really have a very clear idea about what they want to do with it. They're kind of making it up as they go along for most governments. So I don't think we're at a point where we're seeing a very strong coordination between governments yet on how to deal with Bitcoin. But the remarkable thing about Bitcoin, let me put it this way, is that it really changes the equation of regulation, and it changes the effectiveness of regulation, because when it comes to everything else in money, all other financial institutions and all other financial solutions for money transfer or for money saving, with all of these other things, you need government regulation and government oversight in order for these things to operate. With Bitcoin, it's different because Bitcoin operates regardless of government supervision and oversight. And so, therefore, government regulation is only relevant to people under the jurisdiction of that particular government. It's not existential as a threat to Bitcoin. In other words, if this government bans Bitcoin completely, then that's a problem for people who live under that government and who want Bitcoin. But it's not a problem for Bitcoin, because Bitcoin can continue to operate in other jurisdictions. And of course, it will continue to operate in the same jurisdiction that banned it, but it will operate illegally. And we all know that, when governments try and ban things, they don't usually succeed. They just end up making them function illegally. So, this is what is different about it. It's, governments are faced with a different problem when they're trying to regulate Bitcoin, which is that if you make the rules tight on Bitcoin, then you're not stopping Bitcoin, you're just stopping your own citizens from benefiting from Bitcoin.
Now let's compare, like expanding a little bit more and talk about the different protocols and their usage, right? We have seen the Ethereum protocol evolving and expanding to different applications, like from gaming to advertising to supply chain management. Do you think the Bitcoin protocol can evolve and have similar usages?
Well, the Ethereum protocol has done none of those things. It's not really used in any meaningful sense in gaming or in supply chain management or in any of those things. They make press releases about we're exploring using this thing for that thing, but in reality, blockchain technology is completely useless for gaming and for supply chain management, and that's something I've written about in my book. Blockchain, people like to portray that if you're using a blockchain, then you're managing to ensure that there is no fraud and that you can, certify what's happening in a supply chain. That's not true. If you're using a blockchain, the blockchain can only tell you one thing: the ownership of the specific token of the blockchain itself. That's it. That's the only thing that it can tell. Any relationship to anything else in the outside world is still dependent on a third party, which is responsible for making the correspondence between what is on the blockchain and what is in the real physical world. And so therefore, you don't solve the trust problem when you put supply chain management on a blockchain. It's completely meaningless buzzword, and it does nothing. And all of these projects that have supposedly tried to use this, it's essentially vaporware. So there are no other uses for a blockchain other than just building a currency like Bitcoin. This is the only thing that we have seen. And I've been in this space for a while, and I've heard what a lot of people have said. And we've seen many of these press releases, and people were going to be using blockchain for databases and for healthcare records and for real estate and for supply chain and all of these things. None of this stuff has worked. None of this stuff has been used commercially, and none of it will be used commercially because it makes no sense whatsoever. The only thing that it has been useful for is creating a narrative in order to pump a digital currency. The only thing that a blockchain does is a digital currency. And all of these narratives have helped market specific digital currencies. But in my opinion, that's pointless, because nothing about these digital currencies is valuable when they are controlled by a small group of people behind them and they're not neutral protocols.
But even with all these companies and banks and other institutions working hard to get, all these different usages for blockchain.
Yes, especially since then. And I've we've been talking about this since 2015 and 2016. We've just been witnessing more and more people coming up with press releases about we're going to use blockchain for this and we're going to use blockchain for that. And I've been asking people for 5 years now, show me an example of a blockchain being used in the wild. And always, whenever somebody wants to show me an example, all they do is they tell me, these people are working on this model, and in a few years it's going to start being operational, and then it's going to be working. But nobody has shown me one that is actually working, that is commercially employed. The only thing is just launching a digital currency.
Okay. Uh, is it possible to forecast when we're gonna see Bitcoin scaling globally, and we're gonna start like actually seeing people using it as a form of money and reserve and payment, but it's gonna be something like common, and we're gonna see like every day?
I mean, I think it's a gradual process. It's not going to be one day you flick a switch and then everybody's using it. It's growing every year at around 200% per year so far. So in the past 11 years, 11 full calendar years, if this year, if Bitcoin ends this year at around $51,000, which is very close to where it is right now, it will have been growing at 200% per year for the past 11 years. I think this is an astonishingly fast speed of growth, and I think it's a highly unrealistic estimate. Like if you told me 10 years ago this is what Bitcoin is going to do over the next 10 years, I would have thought this is impossible. But here we are. So now it's a question of how much we grow into the future and how fast the growth is. But I think I personally think this growth process is going very well and it's going very fast, and I cannot see it slowing down significantly. So it's really a matter of time, in my opinion. I think Bitcoin adoption is just going to grow. It's hard to put a date on when it will be fully grown, but I think it's just going to grow.
Great. Well, we'd love to continue chatting with you today, but our panel is coming to an end. Do you want to share a final message to the audience? And one more question, like, in your opinion, what's the percentage, given that you're saying it's a reserve of value, what's the percentage in Bitcoin or other cryptos that an investor should hold in his or her investment portfolio?
My honest assessment of this is that you shouldn't think about it in terms of the percentages of the overall portfolio, in as much as it is the amount of money that you are willing to sit on for 3 or preferably 4 years and not need to spend it. And so the amount of money that you want to save for the long term. So for me, for Bitcoin, since Bitcoin is volatile, you don't want to be overexposed with money that you need, because if you money that you need over the next month or 6 months or a few months, it might be too risky to put it in Bitcoin, because you could witness a big crash in Bitcoin and then you're in trouble, if you needed to buy a house and you put it. So keep the money in Bitcoin that you can keep for the long run, so that you are not worried about the daily fluctuations. And then watch that grow, and don't think about it in terms of a percentage. Just keep your long-term portfolio in Bitcoin and keep adding to it as much as you can over time. That's how I would think of it, and it's the long-term investment. Of course, you can have other long-term assets if you find something compelling, but I don't think there are many investment cases that are better than Bitcoin for the long term.
Great. And do you want to share a final message with the audience?
Thank you very much for hosting me. I wish I was able to go in Brazil. I have many beautiful memories from Brazil. I'm a big Vasco da Gama fan. I was there when Romario was making it in Vasco, so I've always been a big fan of Romario and Vasco. I've been to the Maracanã 5 times, and I've been to the Carnaval as well in Rio in 89.
Authentic Brazilian. Well, Dr. Saifedean, it was such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. I know there's still a lot to talk about, especially regarding Bitcoin, but hopefully we can talk to you next time. See you soon, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Com certeza, o que discutimos hoje é apenas o começo de uma revolução e de todo o potencial que a tecnologia do blockchain e o Bitcoin têm a oferecer. E você segue aqui na Expo 2021, que está cheia de inovação. Procure na Cidade Digital a sua próxima atração. Muito obrigada.